Sacramento, November 11th, 1988. Police officers gather behind a charming Victorian boarding house. But beneath the charm, something smells wrong. Something that doesn't belong in a flower bed. Detectives begin to dig. Shovelful by shovelful, the soil gives way, until one of them freezes. A piece of tarp, a glimpse of something pale beneath it. Then, unmistakably, a human leg. Neighbors gasp behind police tape. Cameras flash. Another shovelful, another body, and another. Inside, the boarding house's owner sits calmly in her floral dress, hair perfectly set, glasses perched on her nose. She smiles politely, offering cookies and coffee to the officers tearing up her backyard. Her name is Dorothea Puente, a sweet, grandmotherly woman who ran a home for the needy, the lost, and the forgotten. But as police start to realize what they've uncovered, Dorothea excuses herself and slipped away from the police. That morning, Sacramento discovered that evil doesn't always look like a monster. Sometimes, it wears pearls and bakes cookies. How did this kind and grandmotherly-looking woman become one of America's most unlikely serial killers? Before Dorothea Puente became the polite grandmother smiling on the porch of a Sacramento boarding house, she was a frightened little girl in California's Central Valley, and life gave her no reason to believe the world was kind. She was born Dorothea Helen Gray on January 9, 1929, in Redlands, California, the sixth child of two deeply broken parents. Her father, Trudy Gray, was a cotton picker who drank heavily and wrestled with violent mood swings. Her mother, Jessie, worked as a sex worker and often left the children alone for days. Reports differ. Some say Dorothea had 6 siblings, others 17. But what's certain is that none of them grew up in peace. Their small shack in the dry Central Valley heat echoed with shouting, crying, and drunken fights. Dorothea's earliest memories were of her father waving a gun, threatening to end his life in front of the children. He told them, "You'll all be better off without me." When she was just 8 years old, tuberculosis took him. Her mother, left alone and sinking further into addiction, lost custody of her children that same year. By the end of 1938, Jessie was dead too, killed in a motorcycle crash after a night of drinking. 8 years old, no parents, no home. Dorothea and her siblings were scattered, wards of the state, sent to different orphanages across California. In the one where Dorothea ended up, she would later claim she was sexually abused by caretakers. It's clear her trust in the world was shattered before she even turned 10. From that pain, a pattern began to form, a pattern of reinvention. Lies, for her, were not malicious. At first, they were armor. As a teenager, Dorothea began rewriting herself. She lied about her age, her past, even her ethnicity, telling people she was anything but a poor orphan girl from Redlands. She dressed well, spoke politely, and learned that the right story could open doors the truth never could. In 1945, at just 16, Dorothea married Fred McFall, a soldier newly returned from the Pacific Front of World War II. He thought she was older, and she didn't correct him. They settled briefly into a fragile peace. Between 1946 and 1948, she gave birth to 2 daughters. But motherhood didn't come naturally to her. One daughter she sent to live with relatives in Sacramento. The other she gave up for adoption. She suffered a miscarriage soon after. Beneath the calm domestic facade, Dorothea's life was already slipping through her fingers. And then came her first real brush with the law. In 1948, barely 20 years old, she was arrested in Riverside for forgery, buying women's accessories with fake checks. It wasn't violence or theft of necessity. It was a performance. She wanted to look respectable, glamorous, important. She pled guilty, served 4 months in jail and 3 years probation. 6 months after her release, her husband left her. By her early 20s, Dorothea was alone again, broke, humiliated, and deeply resentful of a world that had never shown her kindness. But she wouldn't stay down. She knew how to adapt. In 1952, she reinvented herself again, this time in San Francisco, under a new name and a new story. She married Axel Brenn Johansson, a Swedish merchant seaman. When she introduced herself, she didn't say Dorothea Gray. She called herself Tea Singawala Nayarda, claiming to be a Muslim woman of Egyptian and Israeli descent. She wore exotic clothing, spoke with an invented accent, and seemed to charm everyone she met. Of course, she never told him about her previous marriage and her abandoned daughters. Axel was often at sea, which left Dorothea plenty of time to do as she pleased. She gambled away his money, threw wild parties, and brought other men home while he was gone. When he returned, they fought. Loud, violent fights that drew the attention of neighbors and police. In 1960, Dorothea was arrested again, this time for owning and operating a brothel, disguised as a bookkeeping business. She pled guilty and served 90 days in jail. A year later, Axel had her committed to DeWitt State Hospital after she spiraled into drinking, fraud, and suicide attempts. Doctors diagnosed her as a pathological liar with an unstable personality, someone who lived in her own self-created fantasy world. When she was released, she left Axel, though she kept his last name. For years, she called herself Sharon Johansson, claiming to be a devout Christian and a caregiver. She presented herself as a woman who helped others, a patron saint of the downtrodden. And in a way, she did. In the 1960s, she began housing young women in need, runaway girls, battered wives, the mentally ill, giving them shelter and food. It was the first version of what would one day become her boarding house. But behind her charity work, the lies continued. She was constantly forging checks, stealing identities, manipulating everyone around her. It wasn't yet murder, but the pattern was forming, helping people who couldn't fight back, only to exploit them. In 1968, Dorothea met and married Roberto José Puente, a much younger man. She was 39. He was in his early 20s, handsome, impulsive, and controlling. Their relationship was volatile from the start. She later accused him of domestic abuse, and he fled to Mexico when she tried to file for divorce. The paperwork dragged on until 1973, but she kept his surname, Puente. It was the last name she'd ever use. Even after the divorce, Roberto would reappear in her life. They fought, reunited, split again, a toxic cycle that left her both dependent and furious. By 1975, Dorothea filed a restraining order. She claimed he threatened her life. Whether that was true or another of her fabrications, no one could tell. By the mid-1970s, Dorothea Puente had lived a dozen lives: the poor orphan, the soldier's wife, the exotic foreign woman, the Christian caregiver, the madam, the fraud. Each version of herself was built from the ashes of the one before. Every time she was caught or exposed, she simply became someone new. She was adaptable, charming, and always, somehow, believable. But beneath the surface, the core never changed. She was still that little girl in the orphanage, convinced that survival meant becoming whoever people wanted her to be. Still that teenager who lied her way into acceptance. Still that woman who couldn't stand to feel powerless. By her 40s, Dorothea Puente was a woman shaped entirely by trauma, deception, and fear. But also by greed. Her kindness had a price. Her sympathy was a tool. And soon, she would discover a way to turn that tool into something far darker and far more profitable. By the late 1970s, Dorothea Puente had finally built the life she always dreamed of, or to be more precise, the appearance of one. Gone was the chaos of her earlier years, the arrests, the endless relationships with unstable men, the drunken fights, the forged checks, the wild stories about Egyptian ancestry. Sacramento, with its slow pace and sunny streets, became her stage, and Dorothea, the woman who had reinvented herself a dozen times, was ready for her most convincing performance yet. She dressed the part, always neat, modest, grandmotherly. Her hair, perfectly set in tight silver curls. Her dresses, conservative and old-fashioned, always pressed and clean. Large round glasses framed her face, giving her the look of a kindly librarian. She didn't dye her hair. She wanted the gray to show. It added authenticity to the illusion. To her neighbors on F Street, she was polite, soft-spoken, and impossibly proper. She never raised her voice. She greeted everyone with a smile and a plate of cookies. But most importantly, she was useful. In the 1970s Sacramento, many people fell through the cracks. The city's homeless population was growing, mental hospitals were closing, and the social safety net had holes big enough to disappear through. Dorothea saw opportunity in that chaos. She opened her boarding house, a simple Victorian home with lace curtains and flower boxes, and filled it with society's forgotten people. The elderly, alcoholics, the disabled, the mentally ill. Her tenants were the kind of people no one else wanted. People without families, without options, without credibility. And Dorothea played her role perfectly. She cooked for them, washed their clothes, helped them sign up for Social Security benefits. She even held Alcoholics Anonymous meetings in her living room, serving coffee and donuts as if she were hosting a church social. She began to build a reputation as a saintly woman, someone who dedicated her life to helping the needy. The local Hispanic community adored her. She attended church, donated money, funded scholarships, even sponsored local radio programs. Everyone knew Mrs. Puente. When she met Pedro Ángel Montalvo, a quiet man who seemed charmed by her warmth, she married him quickly, maybe too quickly. But just a week after the wedding, Montalvo abruptly left. Neighbors would later recall seeing him drive away without looking back. Dorothea didn't seem surprised. She simply smiled and told people he wasn't the marrying kind. Her house, though, was always full. Social workers loved her. They called her a godsend. When they had a difficult client, someone too unstable for a regular home, they'd send them to Dorothea. She'd nod, listen attentively, promise to take good care of them. She called her tenants my children. She'd walk with them to the store, help them with their mail, sit with them in the evenings over tea. She even attended city charity events, always modest, always friendly, always humble. To everyone around her, Dorothea Puente was the living embodiment of compassion. But behind closed doors, her kindness had a price. The moment a new tenant arrived, Dorothea would help them fill out their benefit paperwork, especially the Social Security forms. She was meticulous, helpful, motherly. Then she'd offer to manage their money for them. "Just until you get back on your feet," she'd say. They agreed. They trusted her. And why wouldn't they? Once their checks started coming, Dorothea would cash them herself, taking most of the money for rent and food, and handing the tenants a few dollars in pocket change. Some never complained. Others did. And those who complained too much were asked to leave. It was a perfect system. Steady income, no oversight, no questions. And when her tenants moved out or disappeared, no one paid much attention. These were people already living on society's margins. A drifter here, a homeless veteran there. It wasn't unusual for them to vanish. Dorothea knew that, and she used it. In public, though, her image only grew stronger. She started attending charity banquets, donating to local schools, even hosting dinners for the elderly. Reporters occasionally featured her as a model citizen, a woman helping the poor with her own resources. To the outside world, she was a beacon of hope. To the people living under her roof, she was a woman of strict rules and quiet menace. Tenants were told what to eat, when to sleep, when to leave the house. She inspected their rooms, their mail, their medications. If they disobeyed, she'd scold them with a gentle but icy tone, the kind that sounded polite but carried a threat underneath. And yet, none of them complained to outsiders, because no one believed the words of the desperate over the smiles of a kindly grandmother. But Dorothea's greed had limits, and by the late 1970s, she crossed them. On December 21, 1978, investigators uncovered something she couldn't explain away. 34 state and federal checks that she'd been cashing illegally, all belonging to her tenants. The discovery stunned those who knew her. Mrs. Puente, the sweet landlady who helped the poor? A thief? She was convicted and given 5 years probation, ordered to pay $4,000 in restitution. It wasn't enough to stop her. She paid the fine, smiled for the camera, and kept her house open. Neighbors assumed it was a misunderstanding, an accounting mistake. She was, after all, just a little old lady trying to help people, and Dorothea made sure to reinforce that belief. She cooked bigger meals, donated more, smiled wider. Her perfect facade held firm. But something had shifted inside her. The fine, the humiliation. It made her cautious. She had seen how easily she could be caught. If she wanted to keep her operation going, she would have to be smarter. And when she started taking in new tenants in the early 1980s, loners, ex-convicts, alcoholics, and the disabled, she had already decided one thing. This time, no one would ever come looking for them. By the early 1980s, Dorothea Puente's mask of kindness had grown thicker and darker. Her little boarding house still looked the same: lace curtains, doilies on every table, a faint smell of cinnamon and cleaning solution in the air. To her neighbors, she was still the saintly grandmother who took in the forgotten, a woman who baked cookies for tenants and smiled through her large round glasses. But something had changed. Dorothea had tasted the power of deceit, and now she wanted more. She had perfected the art of trust. A sweet smile, a steady voice, a hand gently placed on your arm. When she offered you tea or a drink, you took it, because who wouldn't accept a drink from a grandmotherly woman in pearls and pressed floral dresses? Only this time, the drinks came with a secret ingredient. Not sugar, not cream, but pills, sleeping pills, tranquilizers. Her kindness had become a weapon. January 16th, 1982, Sacramento. Inside a dimly lit bar, Dorothea met Malcolm Mackenzie, a 74-year-old retiree who liked to spend his evenings with a drink and a little conversation. Dorothea approached him like an old friend, charming, attentive, and full of laughter. She joined him for a few drinks, complimented his stories, and before the night was over, accompanied him back to his apartment. Mackenzie would later remember flashes, her mixing something into his drink, his eyelids growing heavy, the room spinning. He woke up hours later on the couch, dazed. His coin collection, gone. His watches, gone. A diamond ring that once belonged to his mother slipped off his very finger. And Dorothea? Gone too. When the police caught up to her, Dorothea denied everything. She said Malcolm had been confused, and the police believed her this time. But then, it got worse. April 1982. Dorothea's newest tenant, Ruth Monroe, moved in temporarily while caring for her ill husband. Ruth was 61, friendly and trusting. She was a warm, middle-aged woman caring for her terminally ill husband and exhausted by the strain of watching him fade. When his condition worsened, she sought temporary peace at Dorothea's boarding house, a place she believed would offer comfort, companionship, and rest. She liked Dorothea instantly. Everyone did. At first, she helped Dorothea with chores and cooking. They shared meals, coffee, gossip about neighbors. But soon Ruth began feeling unwell, dizzy, nauseated, weak. On April 25th, she confided in a friend, "I am so sick I feel like I'm going to die." 3 days later, she was found dead, slumped in a chair at Dorothea's home. The coroner's report said, massive overdose of codeine. At the time, it was ruled undetermined. Dorothea told everyone Ruth had been depressed over her husband's illness, that she'd taken her own life. And the police believed her again. A kind old lady with a spotless reputation, caring for the sick? Who could imagine she'd be capable of something else? Years later, investigators would reclassify the case as homicide. But by then, Dorothea was already targeting someone new. May 16th, 1982. Dorothy Osborne, 49, invited Dorothea Puente over for a friendly visit. Dorothea arrived with her usual warmth and charm, and a bottle of something to drink. Osborne accepted. Hours later, she felt groggy, her vision blurred, her mind foggy. When she finally came to, her purse was open. Her checks were gone. Her credit cards, gone. And Dorothea, nowhere to be found. This time, the police acted faster. Dorothea was arrested and convicted on 3 counts of grand theft. Her criminal record was no longer just about forged checks or small cons. It was now about theft, deceit, and people who woke up not remembering what had happened. She was sentenced to 5 years in prison. During her time there, Dorothea was anything but remorseful. To fellow inmates, she played the victim. "I just tried to help people," she'd say. She charmed prison staff too, often seen knitting or reading in the library, always polite, always grandmotherly. But behind that sweet demeanor, she was planning her comeback. When she was paroled early in 1985, she convinced her parole officer she had changed, that she wanted to live quietly, to help others again. They believed her. She was placed under state parole until March 21st, 1986, and her federal parole extended until 1990. They let her go, and Dorothea Puente walked back into Sacramento society like a reformed angel, smiling, soft-spoken, ready to help the helpless once again. But the truth was, prison hadn't tamed her. It had refined her. She had learned how to hide her crimes better, how to appear even more trustworthy. The little old lady with the gentle smile was coming back to town. Dorothea Puente had fooled judges, parole officers, and her entire neighborhood. But she wasn't finished. Her next chapter would make her one of America's most chilling killers, hiding corpses beneath the same roses she so lovingly tended. Dorothea Puente's descent into something far darker reached a chilling turning point with one of her closest companions, Everson Gilmuth. Gilmuth was an elderly widower, quiet, gentle, and lonely. He liked letters, old jokes, and collecting antiques. He'd lived most of his life in modest comfort, relying on Social Security, small odd jobs, and the kindness of neighbors. After Puente's release from prison in September 1985, their paths crossed. He had written to her while she was still inside, kind words, hopeful promises. And Dorothea responded, offering him companionship, stability, even the comforting illusion of love. On September 9, 1985, after serving roughly half of her sentence from her grand theft conviction, Dorothea was released. Waiting for her, Everson Gilmuth. It was a public moment, one that lent her life a veneer of redemption. They spoke of moving in together. In October 1985, Dorothea wrote to Gilmuth's sister, with bold certainty. She and Gilmuth would be married on November 2nd. Not long after, she hired a handyman, Ismael Carrasco Flores, to remodel part of her house. Among the jobs, building a storage box, 6 feet long by 30 inches deep by 30 inches wide. She agreed to pay him in part with Gilmuth's truck and $800. When Flores finished the box, he was uneasy. It was nailed shut, heavy, roughly 300 pounds. Dorothea then asked him to help move the box to a remote storage location. But rather than transport it there, it ended up left near a river, about an hour's drive from Sacramento. Something didn't feel right. Then came the ultimate disappearance. On January 1st, 1986, fishermen cruising the Sacramento River found something odd near the riverbanks, a homemade coffin. Inside was a badly decomposed body wrapped in plastic bags, layered under a bedsheet, tape sealing it tightly. No positive identification was made at first. The body lay there, ignored by most as just another tragedy. But for those who knew, suspicion grew. It wasn't until December 28, 1988, nearly 3 years later, that forensic experts confirmed what many feared. It was Everson Gilmouth. Meanwhile, the evidence of Dorothea's deception had already begun to mount. Friends and family were stunned to discover that after Gilmouth's death, Dorothea had continued sending forged letters and cards to his sister, making it appear as though he were alive and well. She had also forged his signature on the certificate of title for his pickup truck, still using it in her name. Even more brazen, she kept cashing his Social Security and benefit checks until July 1986, months after his death. Gilmouth's death was the moment Puente crossed from criminal opportunism into full-blown, cold-blooded murder. Before this, theft, forgery, benefit fraud were her tools. But with Everson, it was no longer about what she could take quietly. It was about what she could hide permanently. To most people, nothing changed outwardly. Dorothea continued living in her Victorian boarding house. The lacy curtains, the flower boxes, the dinners, the kindly demeanor, all remained. She attended church, greeted neighbors, fixed meals for tenants. Always the same polite tone, the same grandmotherly smile. Even after Gilmouth's body was found, Dorothea acted in the same way. Polite calls, friendly letters, social appearances. No confession, no apology. In her mind, the story could still be controlled. The missing man became a pivot in her dark portrait. Gilmouth's disappearance and death were no accident or mistake. They showed how far she had descended. The concatenation of stolen checks, forged documents, unnoticed deaths, and mortal concealment was now part of her routine. Everson Gilmouth was not the only victim. But his case would be the one that finally broke the illusion for investigators. From correspondence manipulation to truck titles, from benefit checks to physical concealment, every step of her deception was methodical. Everson's body in a coffin she helped build. Everson missing in letters she forged. Everson's benefits she claimed. It was the darkest chapter Puente had yet written. When Dorothea Puente's backyard began to yield bones, the true horror of her crimes became impossible to ignore. Each body whispered the story of someone taken too soon, residents she had hidden under the guise of care. These were not faceless statistics. They were elderly, disabled, dependent people whose disappearances she buried, literally and metaphorically, beneath the same flowers she tenderly tended. In fall 1986, Betty Mae Palmer, age 78, arrived at Puente's boarding house. She came seeking refuge and companionship. Not long after, Dorothea took a bold step. On October 14, 1986, she obtained a California ID card bearing her own photo, but listed under Palmer's name. 2 months later, she even changed the mailing address for Palmer's Social Security checks to her own address. Over the next months, Dorothea forged Palmer's signature and cashed nearly $7,000 in benefit checks. Then, in November 1988, the first body was found in a shallow hole in Puente's front yard. It was partially dismembered. The head, hands, and lower legs were never recovered. Toxicology later revealed doxylamine, haloperidol, and flurazepam, drugs Palmer had been prescribed. On October 21, 1986, Puente had Leona Carpenter, age 78, in a hospital room sign a power of attorney she had arranged. Carpenter had reportedly suffered an overdose of flurazepam. Within just 10 days, Dorothea began executing control over Carpenter's finances, cashing her Social Security checks. When Carpenter was discharged and moved into Dorothea's home, the arrangement seemed innocent. But within weeks, in February 1987, Carpenter vanished. In November 1988, her body was recovered in the southeastern corner of Puente's yard. Brain tissue analysis later revealed high levels of codeine, diazepam, and flurazepam. In February 1987, James Gallup, at age 62, took up residence in the boarding house. By July 20, 1987, medical tests discovered a potentially malignant tumor in his colon. Stalling or evading further tests, Dorothea reportedly called his doctors, claiming he had moved to Los Angeles indefinitely. By November 1988, Gallup's body was found buried under a gazebo in Puente's yard. Toxicology showed presence of amitriptyline, nortriptyline, phenytoin, and flurazepam. Again, not medicines one would normally pair without intent. In July 1987, Eugene Gamble, age 58, was found dead from what was ruled an overdose of amitriptyline and ethanol. Gamble had been a tenant in Dorothea's home. Dorothea claimed he had a history of suicidal tendencies. She was never charged in his death, but many later regarded Gamble as a possible victim, suspecting his suicide had been orchestrated or coerced. On October 2, 1987, Vera Faye Martin, age 61, entered the home under Dorothea's care. By October 5th, Dorothea had already begun forging Martin's Social Security checks, over $7,000 in total. By October 19th, Martin had failed to contact her daughter on her birthday, a habit she never broke. In November 1988, her body was uncovered beneath a metal shed in the yard. Toxicology showed flurazepam in her brain and liver. On October 21, 1987, Dorothy Miller, age 65, was moved into an upstairs flat of Puente's house. Weeks later, she vanished. Even after Miller's disappearance, Dorothea forged more than $11,000 in checks in Miller's name. Eventually, Miller's remains were discovered buried near rose bushes under a concrete slab. Tissue samples from her brain revealed carbamazepine and flurazepam. On November 29, 1987, Brenda Trujillo sent a letter to Sacramento Social Security, accusing Puente of stealing her checks totaling $3,500. Trujillo had known Puente earlier. They had been cellmates in jail in 1982. After her release, she lived in Dorothea's boarding house, trusting Puente to help her apply for benefits. Trujillo claimed Dorothea drugged her and called her parole officer, causing her to lose benefits. Brenda was lucky to survive. In February 1988, Alvaro Bert Montoya, age 51, moved in. By March, Puente had filed for payee status over his benefits. Montoya held prescriptions for many sedative drugs except carbamazepine. In August 1988, a roommate saw someone removing his clothes from a closet. Montoya was last seen August 24th and missed an appointment on August 29th. Dorothea told acquaintances Montoya had gone to Mexico. Later, Dorothea had Donald Anthony, a yard worker, impersonate Montoya's brother, using alias Michelle Obregon to tell social workers Montoya was relocated to Utah. On November, Montoya's body was found in Puente's yard adjacent to Carpenter's grave, with loxapine, flurazepam, diphenhydramine, amitriptyline, and carbamazepine present. On March 9, 1988, Benjamin Fink, age 55, entered the boarding house. His brother visited weekly for 6 weeks. By April's end, Fink had vanished. A tenant smelled foul odor from his room. Dorothea claimed it was a sewer backup. April 29th, she had 12 bags of cement delivered. By June, a hole was dug near a metal shed and filled with concrete. In November 1988, Fink's body was found adjacent to the shed, wrapped in a bedspread, secured with duct tape, covered in absorbent pads. Toxicology revealed amitriptyline, loxapine, and flurazepam. Notice the pattern. All Dorothea's victims were always vulnerable: elderly, sick, mentally ill, or isolated. They consumed medications, often prescribed tranquilizers or sedatives. Their Social Security checks were vital for survival. She controlled their mail. She forged their checks. She told neighbors they moved away. She told social services things like, "He chose to go to Mexico," when bodies lay hidden in her yard. She used every invisible leash she could: identity theft, power of attorney, poisoned drinks, forged letters, fake phone calls. She buried her sins under the same garden she prided herself on watering. The roses bloomed over graves. The same lace curtains she placed in the windows hid corpses behind them. By the time investigators reached her yard, The landlady's cruelty had woven into her daily routines. Her victims weren't random. They were carefully selected, subdued, silenced. This was no longer about theft. It was about erasure. By the fall of 1988, Dorothea Puente's Victorian boarding house on F Street still looked like a sanctuary for the forgotten. Lace curtains, geraniums in bloom, and a faint smell of coffee and air freshener that seemed to hang in every room. But beneath the charm, something, or rather, someone, was missing. That someone was Alberto Bert Montoya, whom I have already mentioned, a 51-year-old developmentally disabled man who couldn't speak and needed constant care. He was gentle, trusting, and entirely dependent on the woman who promised to protect him, Dorothea. For months, his social worker, Judy Moyes, had been checking in on Bert. She'd grown to know his quiet ways, the way he'd nod to communicate, how he always carried a small notepad. When Judy stopped hearing from him in the fall, she felt the first ripple of dread. Dorothea told her, with her familiar, calm smile, that Bert went to Mexico to visit family. It sounded almost plausible, until you remembered that Bert could barely read or write, that he had no passport, no family nearby, and no way to travel on his own. The story didn't fit. Judy pressed again. Dorothea repeated herself, polite and unwavering. But behind that porcelain politeness, Judy sensed something was off. A cold, evasive stillness. So she did what no one else had dared to do before. She called the police. On November 7, 1988, 2 Sacramento police officers arrived at 1426 F Street for what was described as a routine welfare check. Dorothea greeted them warmly at the door, her gray hair set neatly, her glasses perched low on her nose. She offered coffee. She smiled. The officers walked through the house, noting how clean and quiet it was. Old furniture, soft music, a faint chemical smell, but nothing alarming at first. Then one of them stepped toward the back door. A sharp, unmistakable odor drifted in through the yard, the sickly sweet stench of decomposition. Dorothea's expression didn't falter. She explained that the old sewer smell again. The pipes have been acting up. It was the kind of casual lie only someone who had told many before could deliver so smoothly. The officers glanced at one another, but, lacking proof, didn't act immediately. They decided to return with a warrant and maybe some shovels. That same day, police also spoke with a former tenant, John Sharp, who still occasionally visited the house. They asked him if he'd seen Bert recently. "Yes," he said, too quickly. "A couple of days ago." But as the officer turned to leave, Sharp slipped a small folded note into his hand. Scrawled in shaky letters were 5 chilling words. "She wants me to lie to you." It was the first break in Dorothea's carefully woven illusion. Later that night, Sharp met the officer again. This time, away from Dorothea's watchful eyes. He confessed everything. The strange disappearances, the whispers about foul odors, the people who moved away but left all their things behind. A few days later, police returned to F Street, with spades, warrants, and a growing sense that the quiet old woman who offered them coffee might be hiding something far darker than anyone imagined. And as their shovels bit into the cold earth of her garden, the secret she'd buried for years began to surface. November 11th, 1988. The quiet of F Street shattered under the scrape of shovels. Police returned to Dorothea Puente's boarding house, not for tea, not for pleasantries, but to dig. A search warrant in hand, a growing suspicion in their gut. The same backyard that once looked like a patch of innocent garden now looked like a graveyard waiting to be unearthed. Neighbors leaned over fences as detectives and crime scene techs marked off the soil with yellow tape. Dorothea stood calmly on her porch, her gray curls perfectly in place, watching as if this were someone else's life entirely. The first shovel hit something dense. Then came the smell. then the silence. Moments later, the outline of a human body emerged, wrapped neatly, methodically, and then another, and another. By the time the day was over, 7 bodies had been unearthed from the yard at 1426 F Street. Each one buried at a different depth, wrapped in plastic or cloth, sometimes bound, sometimes missing parts. A patchwork of horror beneath a flower bed of geraniums. Detectives turned to Dorothea. She met their gaze, unflinching. Her voice remained soft, grandmotherly. "Those poor souls," she said. "They died of natural causes. I just didn't know what else to do." It was surreal. The calm, the sweetness, the denial. As if she truly believed kindness and cookies could mask the rot in her garden. The police asked her to come downtown for questioning. She smiled again, ever so politely. "Of course, officers. I'd be happy to help." She excused herself to change clothes before heading to the station. Moments later, she was gone. Dorothea Puente, the little old lady from Sacramento, the caretaker of the forgotten, had vanished. That night, the search for her became a national manhunt. Every news broadcast showed her picture, a sweet-faced grandmother in glasses, wanted for multiple murders. The public couldn't reconcile the image. She looked more like someone who'd bake you pie than poison you. But behind that face was a predator who knew how to disappear. She boarded a bus bound for Los Angeles, using a fake name, a borrowed smile, and the same charm that had fooled everyone for years. She checked into a cheap motel and blended effortlessly among the city's drifters, the very kind of people she once preyed upon. For several days, Dorothea Puente, the polite landlady with the shovel, became the most wanted woman in America. And while the country stared at her photograph in disbelief, Sacramento police kept digging, because they weren't sure if 7 graves were the end of her story, or just the beginning. Los Angeles, November 1988. A woman sits at the end of a bar, silver hair neatly curled, large glasses reflecting the neon light. She's dressed simply, modestly, sipping her drink with quiet poise. To anyone else, she looks like someone's grandmother, lonely maybe. But to one man, she looks familiar. Too familiar. The homeless man glances at the TV above the bar. A news anchor's voice drones on. Authorities continue searching for Sacramento landlady Dorothea Puente, wanted in connection with the discovery of multiple bodies buried at her residence. He looks again at the screen, then at the woman beside him. Her face, calm, wrinkled, polite. It's the same face on the screen. He quietly slips out of the bar and finds a payphone. Within minutes, the Los Angeles Police Department is on its way. November 17th, 1988. Dorothea Puente is arrested without resistance. When officers arrive, she simply sighs, as if they'd come to escort her home. "I'm glad it's over," she tells them gently. "I hate all this confusion." Even in handcuffs, she remains composed, her demeanor unsettlingly calm, her smile faint but constant. During interrogation, detectives lean forward, waiting for cracks to appear. But Dorothea doesn't crack. She doesn't shout, doesn't tremble, doesn't confess. "I helped those people," she insists. "They were lost souls. I took care of them when no one else would." Every word delivered like a grandmother scolding a misunderstanding child. Back in Sacramento, the boarding house on F Street has become a national spectacle. Television crews swarm outside its white picket fence. Reporters broadcast live from the sidewalk where police once dug. The quaint Victorian house, with lace curtains and flower pots, has transformed into the country's most notorious crime scene. The press calls her the Death House Landlady. Others call her the Grandma Killer. The neighbors, still stunned, just call her Dorothea. The trial doesn't begin for years, a slow-motion saga of legal delays, motions, and psychological evaluations. Dorothea's defense team paints her as a misunderstood caretaker, a woman too gentle and frail to kill. They describe her as a victim of circumstance, arguing that her tenants overdosed or died of natural causes, and that she only buried them to avoid losing her license to operate the home. But prosecutors see through the act. They present check after forged check, all in Dorothea's handwriting. They display bottles of sleeping pills, tranquilizers, and prescription drugs matching the toxicology reports of the victims. They bring in witnesses, social workers, former tenants, neighbors, all describing how Dorothea controlled her residents' mail, their money, their medication, their every move. She had turned her boarding house into a death factory, disguised as a sanctuary. Judge Michael J. Verga presides over the trial. When the defense attempts to separate the charges, to treat each death as a separate case, Judge Verga rules firmly. Dorothea Puente will face all 9 murder counts. The courtroom buzzes with tension. Every seat filled, cameras outside flashing like lightning. Even in that storm of attention, Dorothea remains eerily unbothered. She sits at the defense table with her hair perfectly brushed, nodding politely to the jurors, occasionally smiling. It's as if she's attending afternoon tea, not standing trial for murder. The prosecutors methodically outline her pattern. Drug, steal, bury, repeat. Each victim is poor, old, forgotten. Each check forged with the same looping script, Dorothea's signature of death. They describe the drugs found in her victims' systems: flurazepam, codeine, amitriptyline, medications prescribed for calm and sleep, but in her hands, used for silence. Permanent silence. August 26, 1993. After years of testimony and weeks of deliberation, the jury delivers its verdict. Dorothea Puente is convicted on 3 counts of murder, for Leona Carpenter, Dorothy Miller, and Benjamin Fink. For the other 6 victims, the jury remains deadlocked. The courtroom erupts. Reporters rush for the phones. Flashbulbs strobe. Dorothea stands quietly, her hands folded. No tears, no words, no emotion. On December 10, 1993, she is sentenced to life imprisonment without the possibility of parole. Dorothea nods, still composed, still dignified, as if this were another misunderstanding that will someday sort itself out. Even behind bars, she maintains her innocence. To journalists and cellmates alike, she repeats the same refrain. They died of natural causes. I just tried to help. She writes letters from prison, often ending them with cheerful notes, recipes, gardening tips, and poetry. She never confesses. She never expresses remorse. In 1997, her defense team files an appeal, claiming the jury was swayed by media sensationalism, that Dorothea Puente never received a fair trial. But the California Court of Appeal in San Jose rejects it outright, affirming her convictions. The grandmotherly killer of Sacramento will never walk free again. In the quiet, fluorescent monotony of the Central California Women's Facility, Dorothea Puente lived out her final years. The same soft voice, the same grandmotherly charm, now confined behind prison walls. She spent her days writing letters to journalists, answering fan mail, and crafting her own version of events. I didn't kill anyone, she would write. They were old. They were sick. I only helped them pass peacefully. Between letters, she cooked in the prison kitchen, her favorite assignment. She took pride in her recipes: enchiladas, chicken casseroles, homemade cookies. Eventually, those recipes were compiled into a self-published cookbook titled Cooking with a Serial Killer: Recipes from Dorothea Puente. In her poems and interviews, she painted herself not as a murderer, but as a misunderstood caregiver. Her words were calm, reflective, and chilling in their denial. March 27, 2011. Dorothea Puente dies in her prison cell at the age of 82. Natural causes, the warden said. Fitting, perhaps, the same cause she had claimed for so many of her victims. No public funeral, no family by her side. Just a file closed, a body cremated, and a name that refused to fade. Back in Sacramento, her house on F Street still stands. A Victorian with lace curtains and peeling paint, forever stained by what lay beneath its soil. It's become a macabre landmark. Tourists stop to take photos. True crime fans linger at the gate. On some summer afternoons, locals whisper that you can still catch a faint, sour scent drifting from the backyard. Something chemical. Something like the past refusing to rest.